your presenter, John Ross Cromer. He is a master electrician with a mechanical engineering degree from the University of Pennsylvania. He is an ADCEP certified PV installer. JR is the author of Solar Power Design and Development, an introduction to rooftop solar. He brings years of solar project experience, including residential, commercial, and small utility scale projects, to his work, including an off-grid residential sized home. And here he is.
All right. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon if you're on the East Coast. Let's dive right into this program. Batteries are a fascinating aspect of the solar industry. In fact, I think that they will be leading the growth in the solar industry in years to come. Let's talk about first just a couple of different applications for batteries. Because the real applications of batteries are a little bit different than what you might initially expect. So, a lot of people, when they think of batteries and I want to add a battery to my home, they're really thinking either should I take my home off grid or can I kind of day trade my electricity? So there might be a mismatch between the time that your home is consuming its power and the time that a rooftop solar array may be producing. And so, let's say your utility does not give you a good buyback rate for your solar production. Maybe you can store that energy and use it on site. Maybe your utility gives you a time of day rate structure where you might not even need a solar array, where you could have just plug in a battery to your home and at off-peak times charge up the battery, and then at peak times run off the battery instead so that you avoid that higher rate structure. And then, many customers who have solar on their home, they say, well, could I take my home off grid? And, somewhat ironically, these are the two kind of least popular real market uses for batteries, where instead the market that is hot right now is a grid connected battery rather than an off-grid battery. The off-grid market has always been around. It was the initial application of solar. The off-grid, sometimes it's your only option. Sometimes the cost of grid expansion to get to where you want to be is so cost prohibitive that a very expensive battery is a bargain by comparison. But if you already have the grid connected to your home, cutting those lines and running your home off batteries is more of a hobbyist thing rather than something that is economic. Similarly, the concept of day trading your electricity. Let's say your state does not have a net metering policy, and so they are purchasing the outflow. Maybe your rate is 11 cents, but your utility only purchases the outflow at 2 cents. You could say, well, I'm going to store all my electricity in a battery. The problem with that concept fundamentally is that batteries cost money and they don't have infinite life. And so there is, you take the cost of the battery and you divide it by the total amount of energy that comes out of the battery over its life cycle. And we're going to talk about these concepts throughout the program. But that would produce a life cycle cost to the battery per kilowatt hour output. And so it does cost money to buy, install, and run a battery, and that levelized cost is commonly much higher than, say, the differential between your inflow rate and your retail rate and your outflow rate. And so even in a time of day or time of use metering structure, what we'll see is only in the most extreme energy markets like Hawaii, where the price of electricity is 5 times the national average, does the day trading of electricity with a battery make sense. And when you think about it, you don't need a solar array to day trade electricity under a time of day or time of use rate structure. And you don't see people who don't have solar just running out and buying battery banks. What's more common is if they need something for backup power for a power outage, they buy a much lower cost generator instead. Now, that's not, the whole picture, and we're going to talk about the nuances today in class so you can make the right call when recommending a battery bank to your client as a source of backup power. But the point is the concept of day trading your electricity, where you are charging the battery at a low rate and using the battery to avoid a high rate. That's just not still a very economic application for batteries for most customers. So where is the excitement in the battery industry? What it is in the commercial rooftop solar market. And so commercial customers are billed differently for their electricity than residential customers. So for residential customers, what we are used to in our electric bill is being billed for the total volume under this curve. And so this is a power curve or a load profile. And up here on the y-axis is power. So power is in kilowatts. And along the x-axis is hours. So the cross product of these two axes will give you kilowatt hours. So the volume under the curve here is kilowatt hours. And what we are used to on our electric bill is opening up our bill and reading it, and it's in kilowatt hours. And even if we have a time of day rate at the residential level, maybe we have a higher rate during the day and a lower rate at night. Well, we would just have a kilowatt hour rate, during peak times, and then a lower kilowatt hour rate during off peak times. And even with a solar array on site, we would have, maybe a kilowatt hour rate for outflow and a kilowatt hour rate for inflow. And so for the residential customer, it is very common to have your electric rate structures in a kilowatt hour rate. And that goes back into consumer protection laws to say, look, electricity is kind of difficult to understand. It can kill you, but you can't really see it. We have, the average homeowner doesn't really think about, hey, if I plug in so many appliances into my home, what does that do to the shape of my power draw? And your Public Utility Commission has historically come in and said, look, utilities, you have to give the customer a rate structure that they can understand. And so, residential homeowners are seen as less sophisticated than like the facility manager of an industrial building. And so they're given these kilowatt hour energy rate structures in order to provide a simple, straightforward billing process that they can understand. And even if you have a time of day or time of use rate structure, it's more intuitive to a homeowner to say, your electricity is more expensive between 2 p.m. and 7 p.m. in the summertime, and other times are off peak, and you have a lower rate during other times. But the way that commercial facilities are billed for their electricity is completely different. Um, the commercial facility may have a energy charge on their bill. They might have a kilowatt hour component that represents the volume under the curve, similar to a residential structure. But unlike with residential, where that kilowatt hour comprises all of the bill, the kilowatt hour component for a commercial client may only be half of their bill. Or sometimes it's 1/3 of their bill. Sometimes it's 2/3 of their bill. And it really depends on how much the other components of the bill cost. And so in a given region, your average commercial customer pays about the same as your average residential customer, but how they get to that finish line is completely different. And the main difference is that commercial customers are billed in some way, shape, or form, and usually it's straightforward. They're billed for the maximum peak of this load profile throughout the entire month. And so it's commonly divided into 15-minute intervals. And they say, okay, commercial facility, we're going to give you an energy charge per kilowatt hour, but we're also going to give you a power charge, which is just the kilowatt. And so, the kilowatt multiplied by time is energy. Power times time is energy. Most residential customers have an energy electric bill, whereas commercial customers, their bill is divided between a power component, their maximum load from the grid in a 15-minute interval over the entire month, and then maybe anywhere between 1/3 to 2/3 of their bill is energy, per kilowatt hour. In other words, you go in and look at a commercial electric bill, and their energy component is much smaller than a residential bill. Residential, it's typically 100%, and commercial, it's a fraction thereof. Now, when you combine solar with an energy bill, we've had little stopgap measures to protect consumers on this issue of sometimes a solar array outflows onto the grid, and then a few minutes later, the air conditioner clicks on, and now that same customer that was outflowing is now inflowing. And so what is fair policy for the consumer in terms of how they're compensated for that outflow? And that does pit the consumer against the electricity provider, because what the consumer will view as fair policy may not necessarily be what the electric provider would view as fair policy. And kind of the role of the State Public Utility Commission is to act as the referee in that debate. And so historically, across the US, we've had what's called a net metering law that says, okay, if you have net metering, when you outflow onto the grid, you get retail credit for what you buy back from the grid. In other words, as long as you are not a net producer of electricity, then you get retail value for your solar array. But then again, that really just kicks the can down the road, because it says, okay, well, what does a net producer mean? The utilities would like to define a net producer as an instant interval that says, well, yeah, you can put solar on your rooftop and not buy electricity from us, but what you're instantly netting out to the grid, we're only going to buy that back at avoided cost. And that's, the avoided cost buyback goes back to a law called PURPA. It's been on the books since 1978, and it basically says that anyone who has a power generator that is cleaner than the grid quality electricity. So if you plug this generator into the grid and backfeed power into the grid, and it's cleaner than what the utility is providing, we're going to force the utility to purchase that backfed electricity at their raw cost of doing business. Not their raw price of doing business, but what is the literal material cost of coal before you shovel it in to the power plant, less an administrative fee. And so if the average national retail price of electricity is 12 cents a kilowatt hour, the avoided cost might be 3 cents a kilowatt hour. And it's not just a solar policy, it's anything that's better than the grid policy, and it goes all the way up to 80 megawatt generators. So it's not just a residential policy, it's a commercial policy, an industrial policy. And recently these utility scale solar projects, some of them can cash flow in a given region at avoided cost. And so finally we're seeing power producers come back and say, well, wait a minute, even though we're buying back at the average avoided cost, we're still seeing our baseload power plants become less profitable. And for that reason, there's a tax on PURPA itself. And so if PURPA is being attacked, and that's for avoided cost electricity, you can imagine that net metering, which entitles a consumer to retail value for their electricity, that would be under attack as well. And the fact is, net metering is not a perfect policy because, again, it comes down to that definition of, well, what is the time frame for which the electricity nets out? Is it instantaneous? Is it at the end of the month? Is it at the end of the year? Is it unlimited? And in our solar class, we talk about how, even a net metering policy that is netted out at the end of the year, where you draw the end of the year line, do you draw it right at the end of spring so that, when electric loads increase in the summertime, they don't get the rollover credits? A lot of utilities do that instead of netting out at, what a residential customer might think, well, it's the end of the year, so that's December 31st. So I'm producing all this surplus electricity in the spring, and that rolls over into the summertime when I need it. And then I'm producing all this surplus electricity in the fall, and that rolls over to winter when I need it. Just changing around when the reconciliation date of your net metered credits can make an annual net metering policy act more like a month-to-month policy. And then there's some states like Mississippi, where I'm located, where they've passed net metering laws, and then they've basically defined net metering as being not net metering. And for that matter, globally, the definition of net metering is more like what we would consider to be PURPA, where they would say net metering is the right to interconnect solar to the grid and sell back at avoided cost. So, even when your consumers are saying, well, my net metering policy is not really giving me retail rate, they may not be realizing that they're still entitled to more benefit than what most solar owners throughout the world have. And so for those reasons, the utility can go to the Public Utility Commission and argue with a straight face on the fairness of their net metering policy. And where these debates are kind of going to is perhaps there should be a value of solar tariff that is not retail, but is not also avoided cost, kind of something in the middle that is fair to multiple parties. Then again, that's not always, there's a lot of regional politics involved in electric policy, and that's always how it's been. Now, when you begin to slice and dice an electric bill, moving away from these flat energy rates, but getting into time of day or time of use metering rates, or getting into power charges or demand charges rather than energy charges, the value of your net metering policy can get diluted. I mean, let's say you have a average electricity price of 13 cents a kilowatt hour, but the utility gives you the option to go on to time of day. And so during on-peak periods when your solar array may very well be productive, you have a higher rate, and then off-peak periods such as the middle of the night or in springtime or fall, you have a lower rate. Well, solar, some of that production may occur on off-peak, and so now you're producing at a lower rate than what you would be producing if you just stayed on the flat rate rather than the time of day rate. Now, other states, I think South Carolina was the first one to write into law that if you outflow during peak times, you're entitled to a peak credit. Well, okay, what if your solar array completely zeroes out all of the production during a peak time? Would you still get a peak credit, or would now those credits start accumulating against the off-peak rate? Or so if you have rollover credits at the end of the month, do you get the 6-cent rate, or do you get the 13-cent rate? And so, for all of these reasons, net metering, again, it's not a perfect policy. It's a stopgap measure, but it creates additional debate and additional issues. And what we've seen in terms of policy action throughout the US is that net metering, we had this huge surge of net metering. In fact, most people don't know this. The recent wave in net metering really came about through the Bush administration back in 2005. That was when there was an Energy Policy Act mandate that said every state has to define their own net metering policy. And before you say, well, that's kind of interesting how noble, before that time, we didn't have these digital smart meters. And so the analog meter would just kind of roll forward or roll backwards. And so the consumer, even though they weren't necessarily entitled to net metering, they had it in that analog meter. And so, a lot of this debate over what is the fair compensation for on-site solar is new because we have these digital meters. And I've seen cases where a customer is billed for a digital meter that is not capable of bidirectional metering. And so then they go and install solar, and the utility comes out and bills them again for a bidirectional digital meter. And then the utility comes around and says, well, they're increasing the cost of electricity. And the customer's like, hey, I'm chunking all these meter fees and smart grid fees, and you're saving on your truck rolls. You used to have to send a meter made by. So all I've done is been stripped of my on-site renewable rate, and now I'm getting less compensation. And so there's always going to be controversy over net metering, and it kind of ignores the fact that there's this huge amount of customers in the US where net metering doesn't benefit them at all. And we're going to get into that right now. When you have a commercial building, if it is similar to a residential building, their electric rates are more often similar to a residential electric rate. And usually the line is 50 kilowatts. And so in our solar class, we learned, if you have a 240 volt electric service and you have a 200 amp service panel, the maximum power draw that you can get through this rated panel is about 48 kilowatts. And so basically, if you're a commercial customer and you have one 200 amp service panel, you have a good chance that you're on an energy only rate structure, that you're not on these demand charges. But if you have multiple 200 amp panels in your facility, if you have a 400 amp service or a 600 or 800 amp service, these mid-sized buildings on up, unless they're on a deregulated electric grid and they are an industrial customer with an energy procurement manager who's directly contracting with a power plant for the electricity under a base rate structure, kind of like utility scale contracts. Most commercial customers that are above a 200 amp electric service are on these demand charges. All right, let me make sure I don't have any questions so far. So we do have a questions box and a chat box. One thing is these slides are a little bit out of order than what you might have been sent. The battery market changes, and so I kind of rearranged some of these slides and added some more content. So I've just sent you the Dropbox link so that you can download the slide content. And I think they'll send it out for tomorrow's portion of the program as well. Let's get back into it, as I don't see any questions so far. So this is what a commercial electric rate might look like. So on the previous slide, we saw that the price of electricity was around, here it is down here, around 11 cents a kilowatt hour. So this is a small commercial rate structure in my neck of the woods out here in Mississippi. But then when you get into your commercial facilities, it completely changes. And so here is a mid-size to large, up to a 1 megawatt rate structure where what we see is the fixed meter charge goes up, and now they're on a three-phase electric service. The energy charge is no longer 11 cents. Now the energy charge is 6 cents. And so that is kind of halfway between retail and avoided cost. And so what that means is that if you have a solar array and it's outflowing onto the grid on this commercial facility, it only generates at 6 cents. It wouldn't generate at 11 cents because net metering only applies to the energy charge. There's no net metering policy for demand charges, where if you push X amount of demand onto the grid at peak times, you get a demand credit during off-peak times. That's even more complicated to red tape it up if you're really bureaucratic. You'd be left out of a courtroom because that's not, the demand charges are trying to reduce the impact on the grid. And if we had all these distributed generators dumping energy onto the grid willy-nilly, it would be chaos. On the other hand, we do have utilities that say, okay, well, we'll give you a net metering policy, residential customer, but we're going to change your rate structure and put you onto a demand charge. And so even if you have a rock solid net metering policy in your state, how you're billed for electricity could change the value of outflow solar. Now, these demand charges can get pretty extreme. In out here in Mississippi, we're at up to $18 per kilowatt, which means if I'm on an industrial site and I get into a peak demand cycle. So out here in Mississippi, that might be a farming operation where you're feeding your stockyard at the beginning of the day, and you're running all your mills maybe just for 1 or 2 hours at 4 a.m., but that's when all of your power is on. And so you get this huge surge in demand at the beginning of the day. Well, the power company says, if you're going to stress the grid like that for 2 hours and then not use it for the rest of the day, we need to charge you accordingly. I just did a site evaluation for a customer in Colorado, and they're on electric heat, and it was funny. Their business opens up at 8 a.m. in the morning. Typical 9 to 5 business. And they turn their heaters on at about 7 a.m. And I can see the line of thinking. It's like, well, I don't want to heat my building overnight. I just want to heat it right before I'm gonna have people show up, and that way I use the least amount of energy. But if you take a cold building and you want to heat it up really quickly, what that does is it might use less energy, but it greatly increases the demand. And so this customer, even without batteries and solar, if they had just turned their heaters on at 3 a.m. instead of 7 a.m., they could save a bundle of money because they were on an extreme demand charge. And so the demand charges, this is like a 50-50, where the energy charge is about half of retail price, and the demand charges, they're a little bit higher than normal. A lot of customers, the demand charges kind of peak out at around 15, and it's not uncommon to see $8 to $10 a kilowatt with a higher energy rate. Although in Colorado, there's a rate structure on one utility where the demand charge is like $25 a kilowatt, and the energy charge is avoided cost. And so the power company is like basically saying, you can use as much energy as you want. We're just really billing you for the demand. And so let's say you want to do solar, and you're at the national average price of electricity. It's about 12 cents, but some of that is meter fees and other fixed fees. So let's say you have a net metering policy, and the value of your solar array is at 11 cents a kilowatt hour. And let's say you're looking at about average solar production. It should be kilowatt hour, not kilowatt hour watt. But let's say you're at average production, you're producing 1.3 kilowatt hours per watt per year. And remember, the way we generate this number, let's do an example real quick just to kind of refresh everybody's mind. Um, in class, in the solar class, we talk about different angles of orientation and how whether or not the array faces south or southwest or southeast, it doesn't impact the production of the array quite as much as you would think. The price of electricity varies across the country much more than the amount of energy that the array produces. So there is some fluctuation, but whatever. Let's just go to Kansas City, Kansas, kind of smack dab in the middle of the United States. This is PV watts. I'm going to put it in the chat box if you want to do it for your own area. Well, I'm putting in Kansas City, Kansas. And what I recommend is just going into PV watts and really not changing too much about this. What we're going to do, one thing we're going to change is we're just going to do a 1 kilowatt system. And we'll put it up on a rooftop. There's tracking, and we're going to come back to tracking in a minute because it actually is worth a revisiting when we're considering batteries. And let's just leave the system losses as is. This is going to produce a very, perhaps overly conservative energy production estimate. But, we're just in the preliminary stage. Having a system loss of 14% versus 11% on a rooftop project isn't going to make or break the project. And it's better to be, under promise and over deliver than the other way around. We're going to go up onto a 512 roof surface, about 26 degrees, facing due south. And because we're being conservative on this number, we know that we're going to be within range as long as the array has some kind of southern orientation to it. And then in the solar class, we get into nuances like, once you filled up the south surface, sending your crew to the other side of the roof to add on additional modules doesn't necessarily double your project cost. There's a lot of mobilization costs. There's a hard cost of interconnection, the hard cost of design and engineering. And so, and there's seasonal rates of electricity too, being higher in the summer and lower in the winter. So there are reasons to go on to other roof surfaces, such as even to the extreme, like going on to the north side of the roof in some circumstances. But anyway, what we see in Kansas City, Kansas is that 1,000 watts of solar produces 1,411 kilowatt hours a year. And so Kansas City, Kansas gets a little bit higher than the average production. They're at a 1 to 1.4 scalar. In most areas, you're at a 1 to 1.3 scalar. But I always think knowing that number, how many kilowatt hours per year 1 watt of solar will produce, that allows you to do really good paper napkin, off the cuff energy estimates in the same conversation with your client. Oh, I use 13,000 kilowatt hours of electricity a year, or I use 1,000 kilowatt hours of electricity a month. Okay, well, times 12 months, that's 12,000. I'm at 1 watt to 1.3. So what you need is about a 9 kilowatt solar array to take care of your electric bill. My install cost is $3 a watt. That's a $27,000 solar array. You can do all that stuff in your head without running back to your computer to do an energy model. Well, if my net metered rate is 11 cents a kilowatt hour, and I'm producing 1.3 kilowatt hours per watt per year, multiply those together, and what you get is about 14.5 cents per watt per year of payback. So, it's kind of sad. In Mississippi, I'm doing some projects as the installation contractor. And so there's a company selling the arrays, and they hire me to do the install. And I show up on site, and the customers say, well, how much is my array going to save me? And I'm thinking in the back of my head, well, you've already contracted and purchased the project. You should know this figure by now. But you know, often they don't. But knowing how many you're not just how many kilowatt hours per watt per year your array produces, but if you multiply that by the generation rate of your array, that'll give you a dollar per watt per year payback rate of the array. And so if I say, okay, well, I know that I only want solar if it gives me a 10-year payback or less, at a 10-year payback, that's $1.45 a watt. And yes, there is a 30% tax credit for solar. It's still in place. It's going to phase out over time, but it's still around substantially this year, next year. Really, it's around substantially till 2022, so you don't need to worry too much about missing out on the tax credit. So you factor in the impact of the tax credit, and you get a $2 and change per watt install price is what most of the country requires for a 10-year payback. And most residential solar is selling for above this, maybe in the high $2 a watt to $3 a watt range. And then some of the solar blending companies will be selling arrays that still today at $4, $5 a watt because they're providing a what they call a 30-year, 0% interest loan. Well, they're actually, charging you an arm and a leg up front for the array, and that's where the interest is. But what we see is that for most of the United States, still to this day, the installed cost of solar is above what it takes, even with net metering, to produce a reasonable payback. And so you do have to get into kind of alternate rate structures to really have solar spread beyond the high priced electricity markets or the luxury residential markets. If we want solar to be on every rooftop in the US without subsidy, or at least without excessive subsidy, the status quo isn't going to get us there. And the only thing I'm going to say about the tax credit today is that the import tariffs on solar are so high in this country that they essentially negate the value of the tax credit, which really isn't fair for the solar industry, for customers who don't have the tax liability. And it's also not fair in the sense that people hear about solar and they just think the tax credit, but they don't think about the revenue that's generated now through the kind of extreme import tariffs that we have. But this is a battery class. So let's look for a minute. Ignore this stuff down here for a minute. Let's just look at how most people analyze the commercial solar market. What they say is, well, at 11 cents a kilowatt hour, I would need a $2.10 a watt install cost to get a 10-year payback. And if you're selling above that, you're not going to have many customers. You're only going to be in the luxury market. You might find that after being in a market for so long, maybe all the low-hanging fruit has gotten picked, and the solar rebates have gone away at the local or state level. Maybe your net metering policy has been watered down, and all of a sudden you're running out of customers because in reality, these projects are having such a long payback that most people are not interested. Well, then you get into the commercial market, and instead of being at 11 cents, they're at 6 cents, and they're producing the same amount of energy. And so you multiply these two together. Instead of producing at 14.5 cents per watt per year, they're producing at 8 cents per watt per year. And when you go for a 10-year payback and a 30% tax credit, what that means is your commercial solar array has to be at about $1.15 a watt in order for it to come out of the ground. And most commercial customers, residential, there are residential customers who are happy with a 10-year payback. They're interested in securing, if they know they're going to be in their house for the long haul, they are interested in securing their electric bills and getting that out of the way now, because who knows what the future will bring. Maybe they can add a battery and have some backup power. They want to, I have customers in Mississippi who have giant Confederate flags on their property, and they care about the environment and what carbon emissions are doing to the atmosphere. So on all sides of the political spectrum, you do get people who are concerned about air quality and environmentalism. Well, what's interesting is at the utility scale, you can get utility scale solar out of the ground at around $1.15 a watt. And so if you have a utility that issues a power purchase agreement for 6 cents a kilowatt hour, you will have utility scale solar projects develop in that area. But maybe for IKEA or Walmart or the commercial customers with giant rooftops, and they have some marketing and PR budget, they say, well, we're going to do solar, and maybe a 10-year payback is not what we normally require for energy efficiency, but we're going to get additional kind of non-monetized benefits out of this. But for your average pay less shoe store owner, they're just not going to look at that. They're not going to be able to achieve these economies of scale. There are economies of scale to be had on commercial solar, but it really requires a large warehouse worth of space to get the project costs down below $2 a watt, and getting it down all the way to $1.14, $1.15 a watt is just not possible with today's import tariffs. They do it in Mexico when they don't have import tariffs. Then again, there's this conundrum that says, okay, well, what about the demand charge component? Let's say you look at your demand charge and you say, it's okay, my maximum demand is occurring at 1 p.m. in the summertime, and I'm pretty sure my solar array is going to be producing on a sunny day when my air conditioning load is high. My solar array is going to be producing during demand times. My solar energy is produced at peak times. I'm being billed higher for peak energy. So shouldn't the solar array reduce the demand charge on an electric bill? And the answer is, well, it could, except it's not so much a problem on the hottest day of the month when your electric load is at its peak, but where the problem is on a partly cloudy day. On an overcast day, the solar production is down, but your air conditioning is down too. But on a partly cloudy day, your air conditioning loads are almost what they are on that sunny day. And then you can have one cloud in the sky come by and cross over your solar array, and the inverter, even if the cloud is not on top of your building for 15 minutes, let's say the cloud is on top of your building for 10 minutes or even 5 minutes. Well, the inverter might take that fluctuation in array voltage as a grid failure and either throttle back or power down the array, and then your air conditioning load is still way up as what it normally would be as if that cloud wasn't there. If your building was exposed to full sun, it'll take a while for your air conditioner loads to adjust to the cloud coverage. But now your solar array is turned off, and so it's almost like you don't have the solar array on your roof on that partly cloudy day. And so there really are no demand savings or substantial demand savings to be had. And furthermore, if you live out in the desert and you say, well, clouds really aren't my thing out here, well, you will often see that even though solar produces during peak times, it doesn't produce during 100% of peak times. And so solar will reduce your building load in the middle of the day, but you still have a shoulder peak in the morning, when you're heating or cooling your building, and and the building is sat overnight, and so your heater or air conditioner is just turning on. You get this surge of electricity, and on into the evening. Maybe your solar array powers down at around 4:30 or 5, but you're air conditioning your building until 7. That creates a shoulder peak, and it used to be that you had a peak in the middle of the day, and you didn't care about your shoulder peak because that wasn't driving your electric bill. But now that shoulder peak is your maximum peak. And so the solar array would not reduce your demand charge substantially in that instance. And so it used to be that for commercial solar, the installer just would not model any demand savings and said, well, if you get a little bit of demand savings, that's great, but the project really needs to work without any demand savings at all. And that means we need such a low install cost to make it worthwhile to you that I can't make it work in my budget. Which is why when you go to the airport, you get in an airplane, and you look out the window, and usually there's a warehouse district around an airport, and you're more likely to see a solar array on a rooftop, on a residential home, or even out in a field as a utility scale project than you are on this warehouse roof. And you're like, well, that warehouse is open during the day. It has a large rooftop that would be great for solar. Well, it's because of their policy. It's because of how they're being billed for their electricity that solar rooftop remains vacant. But if we could manage the demand with our solar array, the equation completely changes. So here we are in a demand charge that's not excessively high. It's high. It's not excessively high. At $15 a kilowatt. So kind of like what we're at here in Mississippi, 6 cents a kilowatt hour. Most customers are in the $15 to $18 a kilowatt range. So this is actually a little bit less than Mississippi. If you could save at $15 a kilowatt every single month of the year, divided by 1,000 watts to get rid of this kilowatt component, basically your array would be producing at 18 cents per watt per year of demand savings. That would be kind of like your maximum demand savings. Then you account for the tax credit. Let's see, 15 by 12. So I guess let's just say that this varies on your, because 15 times 12 would give you 18. What we're going to learn in a little bit is that the demand savings, your solar battery, may not be operating at the power level of your solar array. It may be operating at above the power level of the solar array. So the solar array might charge the battery bank for 4 or 5 hours a day, and then the demand savings may only occur over a 2-hour period. So you're taking the energy produced from the solar array and then dumping it into a more condensed time frame. And so the demand savings can actually be higher than just a pure dollar per watt level. We'll have to get into that in the case study. But let's say you could realize at least 18 cents per watt per year, and then maybe up to 26 cents. Either you have a higher demand charge or you have an optimal load profile, which we'll get into in a little bit. But under the right circumstance, if you have high demand charges and you can optimize a system for demand savings, basically what that does is it gives you a much higher generation rate than what just a residential solar array would be doing under an energy only rate structure. In other words, we've had this issue where solar does produce peak energy at peak times, but because of the shoulder peak of a commercial facility, or because of that one cloud in the sky on a partly cloudy day, we've not been able to unlock the peak value of solar production. Which means that if you added a battery to a solar array, what you actually do is unlock those kilowatt savings, and all of a sudden the commercial market, which used to be the worst market for solar, becomes the best market for solar, where you can model solar arrays having 10-year paybacks at prices that are getting up close to the $4 per watt range. And then some solar installers, I'm doing this in Mississippi. The guy who brought me into the industry is doing this in New Mexico, are doing off-grid projects in the $4 per watt range. And so it's kind of funny. I was telling this doctor I built an off-grid home for, he spent about $80,000 on his off-grid project. If he had put that onto a commercial facility in Mississippi, he would have gotten a very rapid payback, whereas going off-grid, the system's just barely going to pay for itself over its life. This will all make more sense when we get into the actual economic models at the tail end of this program, when we get into the case studies. But in other words, when we think about the applications for a battery or a solar battery, customers think, oh, I have a time of use rate, so I'm going to participate in an energy arbitrage opportunity and day trade my electricity. Well, what we'll see is the cycle costs of most battery systems mean that's not a real option. Customers are not buying batteries for that reason outside of your extreme electric markets like Hawaii. So then where a lot of design expertise right now is in the off-grid market, where you have customers where the utility is charging you $30,000 because you have 40 acres of land and you want to put your house right in the middle, and they have to build some power lines to come out to your interconnection point, and they're charging you for that. And so you say, well, if you're charging me 30 grand, then I'm just going to chunk 30 grand into a battery and not build the grid out to my point of use. But it's actually this peak load shaving, where you can just shave off the tip of your electric use. Or maybe, you put a solar array onto your building, and so now that solar array is lowering the demand of the building, and then you get this new load profile, and you just have a battery come in and take off the tip top of that mountain. It's kind of like mountaintop removal for your electric bill. You just have the battery take off those shoulder peaks, or the very top of your electric bill, and that results in above retail savings for the effective generation rate of that system. And this is particularly fascinating because actually before the tax credit for solar, the commercial solar market was picking up steam. There were, it was mainly out in California where they were giving kind of peak demand production rates for commercial solar, and that was causing substantial growth. But since 2007, and the tax credit came on board in 2008, the utility scale market has really taken over. Nowadays, the utility scale market, which is in this light blue, is 60% of the USA solar market. So if there's really one market that the tax credit for solar created, it was the utility scale market. Residential is picking up too, but the commercial market is much more dollars and cents driven, and they haven't had the right rate structure for solar. And so we see that they're just, they're the smallest market segment in the industry right now. Costs have come down in the industry. We do see commercial solar installing for substantially less than residential solar. Commercial solar going for, $1.50 to $2 a watt, where residential solar is more in the 250 to 350 a watt range. So there are some economies of scale that can be had for commercial solar. It's just that their rate structure has been so terrible. But now you combine the larger, less expensive per watt commercial solar array with a battery, it can now generate at the highest generation rate of all three market segments of the utility scale, which would be at a low cost energy power purchase agreement, or the residential array that might be at somewhere around retail price, maybe a little bit less than retail price for the value of energy produced. All of a sudden, you install what I would call a solar peaker plant, and it can produce the fastest payback. So all of a sudden, what we're seeing is the growth in utility scale solar is grinding to a halt. The growth in residential solar is slowing down, but the growth in commercial solar is exploding because people are understanding this business model better. Now, where these markets are first going to emerge are in areas where the price of electricity is expensive. So batteries are very popular in California. Batteries are very popular in Hawaii. But I think it's worth pointing out that there are expensive electric rate structures outside of those markets. What I've discovered living in Mississippi is that rural electricity can be very expensive, particularly for commercial customers. In most parts of the country, residential electricity costs on average a little bit more than commercial, but in rural areas it's the opposite, because it's that manufacturing operation or industrial farming operation that puts so much strain on an otherwise underutilized grid that the demand charges are appropriately high. And so when you look at areas that have a high retail value of electricity, it's not just New York or California, but it's also, Iowa. Here's Independence, Iowa, where they might have a population of 1,000 people, and their electric co-op has to charge a higher price of electricity just because their buyer pool is so small. And so that's where you get into, let's see, here's a cooperative in Colorado at 17 cents a kilowatt hour, whereas the national average is around 12 cents. And so and here's one in Georgia where the average is 16 cents. And so where you get into kind of extreme demand charges are not just in areas like New York and California, but also in rural areas where the price of electricity is starting to creep up. And then they might say, well, effectively, your price of electricity is 16 cents a kilowatt hour, but that might translate into a 6 or 7 cent energy rate and a $20 a kilowatt demand rate. And so when you think about it, solar for the most part, it has existed to date in areas where there are extreme subsidies. You have states like Massachusetts leading the United States in solar power, and some of that has to do with the price of electricity being high on the East Coast, but it's also because they have rather high local and state level incentives. California, it makes sense for there to be a lot of solar there, and they've also put a lot of subsidy into the solar industry, and that's put gasoline on the fire. Then you have states like Texas that they claim to have a really good solar industry, but it's still kind of far behind where its technical potential should be, because outside of San Antonio and Austin Energy and Encore, you look at a place like Houston, Texas, and there's not much solar to be had because they don't have a net metering policy there. And what's interesting is there are other areas, Wisconsin, for example, where demand charges are available for residential customers. And so this solar peaker game is not just a game for commercial, but it's also a game for residential if you have demand rates available to you. You know, just a few years ago in Arizona, the solar industry was suing the utility because the utility was saying, we're going to take all our solar customers and put them onto demand rate structures. And the utility was doing that because they were trying to counteract the net metering laws and reduce the value of solar. And now all of a sudden, the price of batteries have dropped, and its demand charges can offer the quickest payback for an optimally designed system. And you have all these commercial customers on these demand rate structures. You know, if you just assume that, you know, right now solar is 2% of our electric grid, and most of that is in California, Massachusetts, and New Jersey. You know, the idea that solar is making a blip on the radar in a state like Mississippi or Alabama is ludicrous. Well, that said, if you look at a state like Mississippi or Alabama and you just assume that half of their electricity sales come from industry and 2/3 of that revenue comes from demand charges, and that a solar peaker plant with a battery might be able to cut that demand charge in half, you know, all of a sudden you have 20% of the utility revenue that could vanish from the utility coffer overnight. And so it's like, well, you know, you look at all this pushback on the solar industry of reducing utility revenue and utilities sizing up these demand charges to provide some respite from the revenue loss. And then all of a sudden, they're going to realize they're being outflanked by the battery industry because it's producing an even more cost-effective business model and accelerating revenue loss rather than stopping revenue loss. But it's not like they can retreat back into energy rates, which only makes the solar array more profitable. You know, what utilities, what the Tennessee Valley Authority is looking at now is just not increasing the price of electricity and instead just increasing the meter fees, which are already on certain parts of the rural grid out here $34 a month before you buy a penny of electricity. And so here's a map. I think this is the most important solar study that was published in 2017. If you just Google National Renewable Energy Labs in demand charges, they have a database now of all the demand charges throughout the entire United States. And what was so interesting is before 2017, this data you had to find by reading through every single utility rate structure if the utility published their rate structure. Not all do. And on a deregulated grid, then you have to reconcile the wholesale charges with the retail charges. And outside of a local area, it was very hard to get a feel for what demand charges actually were. But the National Renewable Energy Labs has studied that, and they released this map of this is where all demand charges are. And the dark red here, it's above $30. In the red, it's 20 to 30. In the orange, it's 10 to 20. Yellow and white is less than that. And I'd say that the solar peaker plant model, where you know the battery is actually the more expensive component of the entire system, it works whenever your demand charges are over $15 a kilowatt. And so I'm sitting here in Mississippi and I'm bemoaning the fact that you know they passed net metering, but then they watered it down, and then the import tariffs are coming online, and solar's getting more expensive rather than less expensive. And you're thinking, you know, oh my goodness, how is solar ever going to come to my grid and be cost effective without subsidy at the local level? But then all of a sudden I realize, hey, I'm living in North Mississippi and we have some of the higher demand charges in our region. And if I just target the commercial market segment, I can produce paybacks in that 10-year or less range. Whereas previously it was don't even consider commercial solar because there's not the right rate structure for it. And so you can find places in Colorado and Nebraska and Idaho and even Kentucky where the price of electricity might be so low that the concept of solar is laughable. But then again, with the right demand structure, all of a sudden that's the best payback in a region. So it's actually quite a revolutionary study. Most of solar today occurs in California and the East Coast, and 40 out of 50 states are all grouped together at the back of the pack with very little solar penetration. And all of a sudden, what this means is that, the way to cross the Rockies and bring the solar industry into the Great Plains is to focus on the commercial rooftop market. Now, to do whether it's off grid or a demand rate structure, you have to have a very good idea of how much energy, what the real energy use of your building looks like. For a few reasons. One, you don't want to run out of power. And so when you look at it as here's like a residential home, your residential home may be only drawing a maximum of 6 or 7 kilowatts. The service panel is rated for perhaps 48 kilowatts, but not all your appliances are on at the same time. And then also knowing for how long you're at your peak matters, because these battery inverters, they, unlike a solar inverter where you're just used to seeing a 6 kilowatt output rating, the battery inverters are more expensive and they're more functional, and they will give you a rating not just for continuous output, but also for a 30-minute output and also for a 30-second output. And so if you see like your air conditioner clicking on and your air conditioner or your heater turning on, initially it might surge up to twice its operating power. You can look at your technical specifications of your battery inverters and match them to accommodate not just your continuous output, but the spike. And so it used to be with solar, you would look at this power curve and say, okay, I'm doing a 10 kilowatt array and I want to put that on at least an 8 kilowatt inverter so that I'm capturing most of this energy. Well, for a battery system, you're in the off-grid market, you might only need a 3 or 4 kilowatt inverter that can surge up to 6 kilowatts. And so your inverter sizes are a little bit different than they used to be. And we'll get into the nuances on, well, how does the energy get into the battery in a little bit. So knowing not just how much energy your building is using, but how much power, and not just the maximum power, but also what the shape of that literal cone looks like. For how long are you at that maximum power? Are you at that maximum power for 30 seconds or for 5 hours? That can impact the size of your battery bank and the size of your inverter. So your monitoring systems get more nuance. Now, I recently logged into my utility account and discovered that they are now giving me, as a residential customer, this kind of load profile data, which previously was only provided to commercial customers because it impacts your commercial rate structures, but it does not really impact your residential rate structures. So, while your smart meter is capable of providing this data, it has not always been accessible. So you might surprise yourself. You might log into your utility account and see that this data is available and start using that to determine things like, is time of use metering worthwhile? If you don't have that data available, you can buy a service panel monitor, and these are basically current transducers plus a little energy controller that fits inside or adjacent to your service panel and clips around circuits. Now, you have to be careful with these things because not all service panels are big and empty like this, and the concept of monitoring every single circuit on your service panel, you can find service panel monitors that'll do that, but it really clogs up your service panel, and not all inspectors are going to really like you to do that. And then and the current transducers, they cost money, and so you find less expensive systems that'll just do your mains and maybe an air conditioning circuit. And you don't necessarily need circuit level monitoring for this. You have to remember that this is just monitoring the electricity that flows through the wire. It's not controlling anything. Now that said, the reason why you might want a service panel monitor instead of just extracting the data directly from your meter is if this service panel monitor can communicate with other electrical devices in your building, and so that you get that instantaneous communication, so that if your solar array is on and your batteries are at high voltage, your energy controller could tell your heater to turn on. You might have gas heat, and you might have a solar array without a battery, and you might not have a very good net metering policy. And so, you might have a energy controller that says, turn on an electric heater when I'm outflowing so that I'm using less gas. And even though gas heat is more generally accepted to be more cost effective than electric heat, if your electricity is being purchased at avoided cost, that electric heater is more cost effective. If you're doing an off-grid system, it might be that you do have a gas generator, but that gas is precious and you don't want to use all of it. You want to, increase your electric load if it's in the middle of the day and your array is at full power and that your batteries are topped off. Yeah, turn on some electric heating. It wears your batteries down, but you got the power in the middle of the day. So maybe you're switching between electric heat in the middle of the day to wood heat or gas heat at night. So there's some nuances in the different kinds of service panel monitors. On top of that, when you get into battery system monitoring, in addition to like what the solar monitor, solar inverters will just give you the load profile of your solar array. What the battery monitors will do is monitor the outflow from the batteries. That'll give you kind of the load profile of your building. They may also be monitoring the inflow to the batteries coming from your inverter or your charge controller, but then they're also logging the battery temperature and the battery voltage to give you an idea of how many cycles are coming out of the battery, which will give you an idea of how much longer the battery should last. There's this concept that you can't tell the life of a battery because it charges the full voltage and then discharges and charges the full voltage and discharges, and then eventually it doesn't charge back up again. But as we'll learn about how batteries work, they're at the nano level. There is plaque and buildup that occurs on these batteries that is a function of how often the batteries are cycled, how hard they're cycled, at what temperature they're cycled. And so if you're tracking the battery temperature and its inflow and outflow, you can get an idea of how much life you have left in your batteries. And then there's also, load controlling, whether it's the batteries are at low energy, and so you want to turn off your non-critical loads. Maybe you have a transfer switch and a critical load panel. Maybe you have digital controls instead. It might be the opposite. It might be that you're at high energy, and so you want to turn on more electric things. And it might sound as superfluous as having a water fountain in your front yard. And if your batteries are topped off and your solar array is at full sun, the water fountain works and it shows the homeowner that everything's chugging along well. And that sounds really silly until you actually live off grid, and then you start getting phone calls from the customers saying, hey, my system has never run out of power and it seems to be working. I just don't know what's going on inside the system. Having some visual cues inside the home can be done, more artistically than just saying, well, use your smartphone. One thing that we're working on with community solar is just looking at the point where there's really not very elegant solutions for load control. So you can buy a service panel monitor. This is the one I have installed in my home. And this is telling me is, hey, I can have a 2 kilowatt solar array on my rooftop before I really have to concern myself with outflow. And then we have this spike right here. But the point is, you get a lot of these service panel monitors that will just tell you this, but where the hacker community is at is saying, okay, well, we do have power outlets that we can control with Wi-Fi or this Z-Wave protocol, which is like a lower energy Wi-Fi, or even remote control, like your remote control car toys. They have Z-Wave thermostats, they have energy monitors. So we're trying to build one together that does load control as a function of your service panel. And this is really just resulting from a need that we have in Mississippi. There's no net metering. And so in order to do larger residential solar arrays, we need a way to turn on the heater so that we're using more electric heat rather than gas heat, but only when the solar array is outflowing, so that we're using and consuming more of our energy on site and not outflowing it as much. And, digital controls can be used to complement a battery to take load off of a battery bank. So for example, your refrigerator, if you have you can put a little power outlet with a remote control and you can sit there and click your refrigerator on and off. But if you could turn your refrigerator off when your demand is surging, then all of a sudden you're flattening that peak. And that could, if when your building is at peak demand and you can turn off these 120 volt devices, or let's say you have a laptop, your laptop already has a battery in it. So if during times of peak, you can turn off your laptop charging circuit and just run off your battery and save at that demand rate, that can result in substantial cost savings just using the thermal mass in your fridge, transferring between electric heat and gas heat, taking advantage of the batteries that you already have on site. So in addition to just like a smart home being something where, your lights turn on when you're waking up in the morning and it plays your favorite Spotify music, having them actually be something that's cost effective where, if your solar array is under full sun, you're cranking your air conditioner and chilling the thermal mass inside your home so that by the time you get home from work, the sun's setting, but your house is super chill. And so you don't need to run the air conditioner as hard at night. Just optimizing and tweaking stuff like that is cost effective. Doing a solar tracker, generally the line of thought is that tracking only makes sense at the utility scale. And that's because you can install a tracking system that doesn't just move, 10 kilowatts of modules, but actually moves, 10 megawatts of modules. Well, if you're trying to do an off-grid residential system, you have to realize that solar is only going to be working between, a south-facing solar array will only work between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. and it has that camel hump ramp up and ramp down, and at all other times you're running off of your battery bank. And so, doing an east-west configuration or having a tracker array, that's not, you might be producing too much energy, but that's a good thing. You're keeping your batteries full, and you're not cycling your batteries during that time, so you're avoiding the cost of using your battery. Now, we're going to show you how to calculate all those costs when we get into our case study. So we'll take a break in about 10 minutes. And so this is actually kind of a fun niche to be in. I've been in solar for 10 years now. And when we started off in the solar industry, it was really fun because it was almost like every project was a custom design. You'd go out to the site, do a very thorough shade evaluation because the tiniest amount of shade would wreak havoc on your solar production. So you get up on the roof and do a site eval and do a thorough design, then come back to the office and you do all your voltage calculations, and anyone who would program their NEC calculations into an Excel sheet would feel very proud of themselves. Nowadays, we have DC optimizers or microinverters that mitigate the impact of shade. We have inverters like the Solar Edge inverters, where the cost between a 5 kilowatt and 8 kilowatt inverter is not that much. So there's a lot of streamlining of material selection going on, and remote site evaluation with computer software is as accurate as doing on-site shade analysis. And so you might not get to the site before the install. There's solar software that runs through every calculation in National Electric Code for you, so you don't really need to be a master at code in Excel to do your calculation. A lot more of a one size fits all approach. For that matter, the cost of solar has come down. And so it used to be that every single module going on the rooftop reflected $400 of project budget, whereas nowadays it's more like, oh, just buy a pallet of modules and we'll fit them on the roof wherever we can best fit. So the design of solar has gotten a lot more autonomous, and that does put some pressure on the smaller outfits to how do you remain cost competitive when the expertise of solar design has dropped out. Well, your solar battery system is much more complicated. With a batteryless solar array, you design your racking and the wires and balance of system material, and you have your solar array, and whatever electricity you don't dump into your load just flows out into the grid, and the monitoring system really just monitors that one point, and your net metering policy takes care of the rest. Well, now we have, you might not have the solar array going into an inverter. You might have the solar array going into a charge controller. We're going to get into what the differences are in a little bit. But then the charge controller might go into the batteries, and then the battery has an inverter. Or in an off-grid system, you might have a doubly redundant system, and you might have two battery inverters. Or you might have the solar array be separated on its own inverter and the battery bank be on its own inverter. And then you have to look at these battery inverters, and they're going through their design reiterations, because it used to be that the battery inverters were all 120 volts for off-grid markets, smaller off-grid markets. And so you'd have to say, okay, well, does my battery inverter have a 240 volt transformer? Now there's so many different ways to use a battery system. Do I use it for commercial load leveling, or do I use it for off-grid living? Or does my utility say your solar circuit on your grid is so overloaded that the only way you can do solar is to not export any electricity? And so the inverter might have to throttle back its output if your load is less than what you're producing. And that's a real problem in Hawaii, where the price of electricity is so expensive that everyone's doing solar. Your monitoring system is now monitoring not just the output of your array, but the output of the electricity through every single point, and not just your electricity, but the temperature and voltage levels of your battery bank. You can incorporate a generator into these systems. We'll talk more about that, but how it interfaces. Like, if the batteries are low, do you switch onto the generator only? Because if the batteries are low, you pretty much know you're going to be running the generator all night anyway. And so just run off the generator instead of running off the batteries, and then let the solar array charge the batteries up when the sun comes back up. Or are you in Puerto Rico and you want the generator not to switch between the functions, but you might be mainly running off a generator, but you want to have the solar array to work and complement the generator to reduce the gas consumption of the generator. So you might have a system where you have a battery inverter that's only 6 or 7 kilowatts, and you say, well, what happens if I throw a New Year's Eve party and I'm drawing 20 kilowatts of power out of my home? Is the generator going to complement that power, or is it going to replace that power? All of these are design considerations, and generally where it comes down to is for the more complex, like if you're not building a tiny house off grid in Colorado, but if you're doing a commercial facility or a larger off grid home, this is where in solar we get into, well, you can do a load side connection or you can do a line side connection. Basically where it's coming down to is between your electric meter and your load panel. National Electric Code allows you to tap onto this line. And so it used to be that you would put like a disconnect switch and your solar inverter at that point. So here's your inverter. Well, nowadays, what you might do instead in new construction is to go ahead and put a service panel there, and that's where you would tie in your inverter, your battery inverter, your generator, and while you're at it, put it on a transfer switch so that it can, during a power outage, it can disconnect from the grid and still operate. So designing that kind of energy panel or energy distribution panel ahead of your load is kind of a new thing. Generally, in my experience, you don't want to overbuild though. You want to make sure you have space for it all, but all this stuff changes over time. The off-grid service panel that I've had is kind of neat because it's a combined DC and AC service panel, where half of it is for your DC components, the other half of it is for your AC components. Now, whether or not you really need that versus going to Home Depot and buying 2 separate service panels, it just depends on how nice you want it to look and how much budget you have. And so off-grid battery systems have really evolved over the years. And so this is the way that kind of the old school battery system worked, is you'd have your solar array going into a combiner box, and then your combiner box landing on a DC to DC charge controller, and then the charge controller going into the batteries going into a single inverter, and the inverter either feeding your load or going out onto the grid. Now we have a lot more different options. So what we're going to do right now is we're an hour and a half into the program. This is a 6-hour program, so we just kind of did a whole race through. This is where the market's at. Now we're going to get into a little bit more technical detail on how to start piecing this stuff together. Let's take a 15-minute break. We'll pick back up in 15 minutes, It's 1:30 Eastern time, and we'll pick back up at 1:45 Eastern time. So 15-minute break, back in 15. I'll start back up in a few minutes, about 30 seconds or so. All right, so welcome back. I'm going to get right back into it. I run a Slack community that's free to join. I put the invite link into the chat box. What Slack is it's just a messaging, communication, discussion board group, and I put my course video recordings into the Slack so that if you want access to not just the slides but the commentary, I'm more than happy to provide it to you through that medium. So you should be able to just click on that link and join. You can do it now or after class, or just email me later, and then I'll resend it to you. So let's get back into the discussion. Even before the era of grid-connected solar, the way off-grid solar worked was you'd have the solar array going through a charge controller. Now, what this does is the voltage in your array fluctuates up and down, with clouds passing over the array, the sun rising and setting, and even things like humidity in the air can refract the photons in sunlight, so that different modules get slightly different amounts of power in them. But you don't want to be slamming your batteries with higher voltage. In fact, your solar array, may be operating at a voltage that's too high for a battery. And so while you can take, say, a 30-volt solar array and a 24-volt battery and wire them up directly to each other, that battery is going to see a shorter lifespan because the voltage is still going to be spiking up and down. And generally, you're going to be wanting to put a higher voltage into a lower voltage battery bank. Just how voltage works. It wants to flow from I kind of look at it as a boulder on top of a hill. That's your high voltage potential, and the boulder wants to roll down the hill into a lower potential, almost like the difference between potential energies, except this is potential voltage. And so we would regulate that voltage going into the battery, and then our inverter would draw off the battery to get into the load. Or you might have a separate voltage controller, feeding direct DC circuitry, which is common in like a recreational vehicle where you might have 24-volt outlets. Now, with grid-connected solar, they said, well, we don't need a battery. We can just, any surplus energy can go directly into the grid. And so the charge controller went away too. And for that matter, now on a residential home, you might have 2 or 3 solar circuits. It used to be that your inverter only had one landing terminal, and so you would combine them into a combiner box and then land on the inverter. Now, a lot of inverters do the combining inside the inverter itself, so you would just run all 3 circuits back and land directly onto the inverter. So maybe even the combiner box is dropped out of batteryless solar design. And so when we're adding batteries back into the mix, a lot of installers have to kind of think about, well, wait a minute, how does this battery work? Does all of the electricity actually travel through the battery so that every kilowatt hour is cycling the battery? Or what happens if my solar array is on and my battery is full and I'm drawing load, is it drawing it out of the battery and then from the array? Basically your battery has voltage in it too. And so when it's full, it's going to be up at the top of its voltage level, and the charge controller is going to be charging it at that voltage, and the inverter is going to be pulling it off of that voltage. And so if you have as much voltage going into the battery as voltage coming out of the battery, there's still inefficiency involved in that system, but it's not really cycling the battery. So what happens if your load is small and your batteries are full and your solar array is high? Well, what that'll do is basically it'll elevate the voltage of the array. And when you think about it, if this circuit was completely open, if it was cut, your voltage would be at its maximum potential, and there'd be no power or current flowing out of it. And so if your system, if your solar array is capable of producing more power than what is your load is drawing from it, your array might just have some of that potential remain as a higher voltage element potential up on the rooftop. Now, your battery inverters have gotten more functional over time. Perhaps one of the greatest misconceptions of the industry is that the solar array and, say, a generator, a lot of people think that they have to be separately derived. And they don't. I mean, you can have a generator and a solar inverter kind of operating in parallel to each other. And it can be confusing because, sometimes the inverter might have a transfer switch between the generator and the inverter. And sometimes it might have a breaker panel where they can be in parallel with each other rather than switching between each other. And there are elements of National Electric Code that say, if you have, let's say, an automatic transfer switch between the grid and your off-grid system, that if you're supplying power to the same load, that they cannot be separately derived, that they need to share a common neutral so that you're able to safely monitor so that your ground fault protections work. We get into that more in the National Electric Code class. For the purpose of this class, just know that there are ways and configurations in these battery inverters so that they will operate in parallel with a generator. And that could be a few different ways. It could be assisting a generator so that you're running a generator. Let's say you're in a temporary construction site. And so you have a generator there for your electrical equipment. You can have a solar battery plugged into this inverter that will work with your generator so that when you have sun, you're drawing your power from the solar battery. And when the cloud passes over, now you're drawing your power from the generator. And based on what generator you have, it might be able to vary its load. These are sometimes called inverter generators, where they can throttle their output based on the power level coming out of the solar battery. And basically what that does is it reduces the consumption of your gas generator. And there's also a lot of synergy that you can get between a generator and a battery bank, where you may have a communication system where the auto start, say on a stationary generator, might be triggered by the battery inverter if the battery voltage depletes. And so if your batteries are getting down to 50% full or 20% full, hey Clyde, this is actually the slides from Rev 1 and Rev 2, I've kind of changed the order around a little bit. Um, so this we're actually on a Rev 3 PDF, and I didn't get it to Half Moon in time. I was making some edits to it this morning, so that's my fault. There should be a link up at the top for a Dropbox link to Rev 3. And so if you click that link, you should be able to get to it. So my apologies for that. But you can have, anyway, you can have control circuits that will turn the generator on and turn the generator off based on the voltage level of the battery bank, so that you're controlling the output. Because what you don't want is for the solar array to produce power and backfeed a generator. Now, what would happen if you are not controlling this power through your battery inverter and you have a load that is small and you have a solar array that's at full power and you have a generator that's being backfed? What would happen is the generator would kind of grind to a stop, and that could be bad for the generator. What is more likely to happen under that circumstance, though, is that it kind of acts similar to a power failure when that generator is choking and being backfed, where your inverters still have protection mechanisms in there that say, look, if this is a grid connected inverter, it has to power down during an outage or be on a transfer switch. And so your battery inverter can actually trick your solar array into turning off if it needs to. If it says, now hold on, your solar array, our batteries are full, and either the grid is on and we can't backfeed the grid, or we have a generator on and we're concerned about backfeeding the generator, it could either turn the generator off and then drain down the batteries. But let's say you had a generator that needed to be on for grid stability. Maybe you have a large generator and a small battery, or maybe the generator is just a small generator and the array is substantially larger than that. So potentially you could be backfeeding the generator with more power than what it's rated for. What will happen with that is that the battery inverter can vary the frequency to basically trick the solar array into turning off. And so we have a question that says, yeah, Ed, so you're saying your system can't get to Dropbox, and that's all right. I'm putting in my Gmail, and you can just email me after class, and I can give you the PDF slides in the order that I'm presenting them today. And that way you'll have them for tomorrow if you want to print them out and take notes as we go along. But again, you can also join the Slack and get the this very recording too. But let's say I've already installed a solar array, and it's a batteryless solar array. So here I have a solar array, and it wouldn't be quite like this configuration. It would be on a couple slides from now, where we have an existing solar array on its own inverter, and now we've gone and added a solar array and a battery bank and a battery inverter. You can basically turn this existing solar array on and off by utilizing its existing anti-islanding UL certification. So when there's a power failure, the way the inverter reads that is a few ways. It could be a outside the operating voltage limits of the inverter. It might need to detect voltage to turn on. but there's also a frequency shift. And so if you have a massive power failure, say a tree falls over some power lines on the grid, uh, that registers as a frequency shift. So your grid is at a 60 hertz signal, and if a tree falls over the power lines, that frequency can rise, or it might, it goes down to like 57 hertz instead of 60. So I'm not sure if that's rising or lowering, but it changes. And in a similar fashion, the battery inverter can vary the frequency of your electricity, say from 60 hertz to 57 hertz, just momentarily. Not enough for it to really blip your electricity, but enough for the batteryless inverter that's already on site to turn off. So there's a question, can you add batteries to an existing solar array? Say I have a micro inverter system. The battery inverter can in fact control the batteryless system. What's more important is that you just have one kind of master battery inverter that's controlling all functions. And so what can be a little surprising is that one of the only things that battery inverters cannot do is have batteries with multiple kinds of battery chemistries, because they may not have a control system set up so that you can have multiple master inverters that are operating independently of each other while powering the same circuit. So they have to kind of work in lockstep, and you need to have one inverter kind of being able to send out that pulse to turn off your other solar arrays as needed. But it is possible, let's say you installed a solar array with an inverter manufacturer who either doesn't have a very good battery solution for you, or maybe the inverter manufacturer has gone out of business, and so they've never gotten a battery inverter to market to complement their batteryless line. You can just like you can parallel two solar arrays of different manufacturers together on the same service panel. You can put a battery inverter and a batteryless inverter on the same service panel and have the system work. Pretty much the only thing you can't do is have two battery inverters paralleled on the same panel and have both of them be in what's called a master mode. And so if I'm doing a two inverter system on an off-grid home, and that's because I want it to be doubly redundant, so if one inverter fails, there's still another inverter there to have power while the failed inverter is being repaired. When you're installing two inverters in parallel to each other and they're both battery inverters, it really helps for them to be the same manufacturer, because you'll have to put one into a master mode and the other into a slave mode. And that's I'm not sure manufacturers of battery inverters support that kind of cross breeding between different battery manufacturers. So the next question is, okay, so your battery inverter can handle a generator input. Sometimes they can handle two AC inputs so that it could switch between, say, a generator and the electric grid. And that usually is a transfer switch that comes with the inverter. And so an inverter that has two AC inputs, one for a generator, one for a transfer switch, it's not even unheard of to have an off-grid system where you have a small generator and a large generator. The small generator might be there to provide complementary power to the solar array, and the large generator may only be there for if the batteries fully deplete to charge the battery bank back up rapidly. We get into that later. Or you could have a cheaper battery inverter that only has one AC input. So you'll see that appear on a specification sheet, the number of AC inputs that an inverter has. On my off-grid home that I designed, I went ahead, even though we only had one generator and no grid connection, I went ahead and specified an inverter that had two AC inputs, even though it was a little bit more expensive. We're talking about $200 out of a $80,000 system, so I'm really meaning just a little bit more expensive. And that was basically because it was my first system, and if I really messed up the design, I wanted them to be able to actually build the grid out there and plug in if they decided they didn't really like the off-grid living as much as they thought they would. And from talking with battery inverter manufacturers, they will tell you that there is a hacker community out there that will have, say, one master inverter, battery inverter, providing what would be the grid signal with its own battery bank, feeding a separate battery inverter that is the master for the home, but they don't support that. It requires more advanced controls. So the really kind of like the starting question is, well, what do I do? Is it better to have my solar array kind of do the old school method where the solar goes through a charge controller and then into a battery, and then we have one inverter coming off of the battery and then going into my load? Or is it better to have the battery bank on its own battery inverter? So like we have here, and this picture is blurry, I apologize for that. What we have is a battery bank on its own inverter feeding a load panel, and a solar array on its own inverter parallel to that load panel. Both options are valid. And so this option is called AC coupling. This is kind of like the newer option. You would do AC coupling would be as if you had a solar array already installed and you wanted to add, say, a Tesla Powerwall to your service panel. That would be an AC coupled system. Whereas the old school method would be DC coupling, where you have the solar array going through a charge controller into the battery bank, and then one inverter coming off the battery bank. So you got two different options: DC coupling, AC coupling. Well, which is better? Now, from a pricing analysis, the end result is that really the cost of either configuration comes out to be about the same. Now, there's a slight difference and from a technical perspective, DC coupling should be the cheaper of the two. But there's a lot more just plain batteryless inverter manufacturers out there than there are charge controller manufacturers at this point. And so, especially now that you have a wide range of inverters to select from, even within the batteryless market, there's premium batteryless inverters, and then there's and a premium batteryless inverter might have 3 input circuits on it, whereas the cheapest batteryless inverter might only have 1 input circuit, and you need to use a combiner box, and there might be some shade mitigation you gain having 3 input circuits versus 1 input circuit, and lo and behold, the batteryless inverter with 3 input circuits cost more than the one with less functionality. And so the whole question on whether DC coupling and AC coupling is cheaper is by and large you're splitting hairs. And basically the more expensive system is going to have more functionality. The less expensive system will have less functionality, and maybe it comes down to a matter of budget. If you're trying to do the hippie retirement plan where you want to retire with $50,000 in your bank account by going and buying an acre of land in the middle of Colorado and buying a pallet of solar modules in a yurt, you might be forced because of budget reasons to go with the lower end battery inverter and an unshaded array, and you might be able to piece together a solution like that. If you're doing a high-end off-grid home where the homeowner might be a doctor or a lawyer, who doesn't really know much about electricity, and they like the technology, but they're not going to be able to really get into the nuances of their system. You might want to sell them a more expensive system that has more autonomy to it. Usually it's a function of do you have anything already on site? If you already have a solar array with a batteryless inverter, then you're just going to do AC coupling because it's already there. It could also be a matter of location. If your battery is going to be in a separate room from your solar array, let's say you're having your battery is, I don't know, inside your garage, and your solar array is is a ground mount out in the field. Then you might do AC coupling just because it's further apart. And so if you're building out a microgrid with multiple service panels and maybe a couple of different buildings, you inevitably move into AC coupling. And for that matter, utility scale projects, they commonly utilize AC coupling because of that. Either the ground mount utility scale solar array is already built and they want to add batteries to it, or they might have the batteries be in a different section of the field than the solar array, and so AC coupling is just easier. Whereas DC coupling, technically, you can spend a little bit less money, but when it comes down to it, you only save money on DC coupling if you're trying to build the cheapest system possible. And by the time you get into your higher end battery inverters and your higher end charge controllers that you would really want to offer, to someone who wasn't like a do-it-yourselfer on a very constrained budget, you could still do a DC coupling system, but the components are right now fairly expensive. Maybe if the battery industry ramps up and changes, that's different. One problem we have with costs in the industry is a lot of the battery inverters that are on the market are one size fits all, where your SMA inverter, your Outback inverter, your Schneider inverter, or your Magnum inverter, three of those four companies all derived from the same parent company, Trace. And then SMA came over from Europe. And so your Xantrex and Outback and Magnum all have very similar architectures, and SMA is a little bit different. But all those what's the solar industry would consider to be your mainstream off-grid, even though many of them are listed for grid connection, so they can be on-grid too. But your mainstream battery inverter manufacturers who are in the solar space, you can put a lithium-ion battery or a lead-acid battery onto them. And lithium-ion banks are at a higher voltage than lead-acid, and then with lead-acid, it's common for a home to be at 48 volts, but for an RV, you might be on 24 volts, or a tiny house, you might be on 24 volts if you're budget constrained. And then for a very small application, like some weather monitoring station, you might be on 12 volts, and the battery inverters can take all those different configurations. Whereas like Tesla, with their battery inverter, it only works with the Tesla Powerwall, which means it's only designed to work with the Tesla Powerwall, which is a higher voltage lithium ion. And so some of the problem with DC coupling is that technically it should be cheaper, but because the products are not specifically designed for the application, but are instead designed to accommodate a variety of applications, they have more stuff inside them that doesn't really need to be there for a specific application. And so you add up the parts and you're like, well, wait a minute, my costs are the same of doing DC coupling versus just buying two inverters. And furthermore, there's also a question of efficiency, which is more efficient, and that also has to do with your application. And so in DC coupling, you go from your solar module through your charge controller. And every time you process your electricity from one voltage to another voltage, you're going to get efficiency loss. Those DC optimizers up on your rooftop, they may result in a more efficient system round trip because they mitigate the impacts of shading, or what we were talking about with the on a hazy day, the sunlight could refract so that one module is producing one more watt than its equivalent next door neighbor, just because it's getting a different amount of sunlight. And you add up all those small things, and even though the DC optimizers might remove 0.5% of efficiency from the system, that might save you 3% of efficiency loss if you didn't use them. And so what I'm trying to say here is your every time you process your energy, even though it might result in a round trip, the optimal configuration, you're still fundamentally going to be losing a little bit. Every splice you make in a cable, you're going to lose a little bit of efficiency. And so what we're doing is we're processing this energy through the charge controller, and that's going to result in efficiency loss. And then we're going to process the energy through the battery inverter, and that's going to result in efficiency loss. And so that's a two-step process. Step one, step two, and now we're at our load. Whereas if I want to draw the power out of this battery, we've actually processed it 3 times. We've gone from our solar array through our inverter, and then we've gone through our battery inverter as well, and then we've come back out of the battery inverter. So that's a 1, 2, 3-step process. And so you could say, okay, well, AC coupling then seems to be less efficient than DC coupling. And, yes, that is true, except that if we're doing this 2-step process here, what happens is the solar array turns on in the morning, and then it fills the batteries up. And then, that if the batteries are full and it's not at night time, but it's still 3 p.m. in the afternoon, this energy still has to cross through the bus bars and whatnot to get to the load. Well, if your batteries are full and your solar's full and you can't dump it onto the grid, you're going to have wasted energy because of that mismatch, where you're going to be overproducing in this off-grid setting. Whereas with AC coupling, you're commonly grid tied. And so if my goal is to sell back surplus electricity to the grid, if my system's DC coupling, I'm going through 2 processes before I sell back to the grid. Whereas if I'm AC coupled and if my system is grid connected, I'm not going to be doing that energy arbitrage where I'm storing my energy in my batteries and then discharging it in my load and trying to go for a zero export. What's going to happen is I'm going to fill up my batteries, and because my batteries are still expensive at this point in time compared to the opportunity presented by energy arbitrage, unless I'm using a high-end premium battery that has super efficiency on it, and generally those batteries are not going to be cost effective for energy arbitrage. What's going to happen is, really, for a grid connected system with a battery, either I want to store the energy in that battery until I need it for load leveling, and so I don't want to just sell that electricity back. I want to keep it there so I can deploy it when I need it. Or I'm going to sell that electricity back, let's say it's through net metering or through avoided cost. Either way, in an AC coupled system, backfed electricity is only processed once, whereas in a DC coupled system, it's actually a little bit less efficient because it's processed twice. And so for utility scale architecture, it's common to see an AC coupled system because usually the solar array is going to be plugged directly into the grid, and they're going to be plugging all of that electricity into the grid that they can, and then just deploying the batteries as needed. If I'm doing a solar array and my customer wants to add a battery because they want to use the solar array when there's a grid outage, that might only require a very small battery that just kind of sits there and does nothing except start the solar array during the power outage. And so I'm not really using that battery for anything more than similar to a battery inside your car or a battery inside a generator, just to enable it to start up. And so if my goal is to sell electricity back to the utility, and I'm doing that as a matter of routine operation, AC coupling is the preferred architecture. If I'm living off grid and there is no way to monetize the power, well, at that point, it doesn't really matter, because either way, under DC coupling or AC coupling, you're dealing with an inefficient system where you're producing more power than what you're consuming. And so whether or not you lose, an additional 0.5% because of this 3-step process versus the 2-step process, it doesn't matter, because you're going to be overly productive anyway. And so kind of where it comes out is that this issue is not very important. The costs are about the same. If you had to come down to it, AC coupling is kind of the preferred method when you're grid connected, and then DC coupling is a preferred method when you're staying off grid, but only when it's like a small self-contained off-grid system and not a microgrid where you have maybe 4 or 5 houses sharing multiple solar arrays and multiple battery banks, at which point you're AC coupled anyway. And many customers who are doing solar or batteries right now already have solar, and so you're just adding batteries onto the existing system. Let me look at the questions. Yeah, so the one question is, are Sunny Island and Sunny Boys manufacturers? They're both SMA inverters. And so what's kind of interesting, some nuances between there are nuances between DC coupling and AC coupling, and also nuances between staying within the same manufacturer and going with different manufacturers. So let's say you have an AC coupled system where you have your solar array and you have your batteries on a separate inverter. And let's say in this design scenario, we're going for off-grid, which is not the most common design scenario nowadays, but let's just assume it is. Either it's in the future and utilities have stopped charging you for your electricity. They just give you a flat bill. Your electric bill is $100 a month for your grid connection, and you have to stay within certain parameters, kind of like a cell phone bill, where it's just $70 a month and you get so many minutes. That might be what grid operators do in the future, so that it's just distributed energy, but they still collect revenue for maintaining the grid. So whether or not you're doing an off-grid system or we're in a future where we have customers wanting to disconnect from the grid to avoid those fixed fees, that would be this design scenario. So let's say you've already done an inverter with a solar array and then you add a battery to it. And so now your batteries are full and your solar array is producing too much power for your load. Your battery inverter shifts the frequency through the grid and turns off the solar array, and then your home is running off your batteries until they drop down from 100% charge to maybe 80% charge. And then the solar array turns back on and charges the batteries back up, and they go all the way to the top. Any power that could be coming from the solar array goes into your load. Any surplus power is being used to charge your batteries back up. Then your batteries get all the way to the top, and it keeps yo-yoing your system and turning your solar array on and off between the batteries being 100% full and 80% full. That what that's doing is it's cycling your batteries slightly. Now, when we'll get into it, either the batteries can be cycled without much loss or damage, or you're dealing with other kind of batteries where if you deep cycle them, they take a lot more damage than shallow cycles. And we'll get into those nuances in a bit. But if the two inverters are not of the same manufacturer, you can AC couple them and be off grid and be fine, but you're still going to deal with this little yo-yoing effect. It actually might be better instead to yo-yo your loads and have like I was saying earlier with energy controllers, you might have a outdoor heater, and it might be the middle of the summertime, but because your solar array is at full capacity and your battery banks are full, it would be better to turn the heater on and not draw off the batteries than to turn your solar array off and draw off the batteries, because that way you're not using your batteries. And so that's where like having a bird bath that could shoot water into the air when you're at full power actually might not be such a bad idea. SMA, to your question, is the Sunny Island and the Sunny Boy inverters. This is all from the SMA product line. And so the Sunny Island is their battery inverter, and the Sunny Boy is their batteryless inverter. And what's gained by having, regardless of if it's SMA or another company, and so Tesla and SolarEdge have kind of teamed up and said, we're going to share the same communication protocol. Or using a Sunny Island and a Sunny Boy and staying within the same manufacturer product line, you share the same communication protocol. And so if you, instead of having two different manufacturers paralleled on the same circuit, if you AC couple the same manufacturer, what SMA does is they say, well, rather than yo-yoing our battery, we're going to send a signal that doesn't turn off the inverter, but instead our inverters are capable of throttling back some power. And so that way the solar array is simply less productive and you don't have to draw on your batteries. And that would be an example of where you're paying more for your inverter system up front, but it might result in total life cycle cost reduction down the road. And likewise, that's where it's somewhat important to have your charge controllers and your battery inverters. It's not critical that they're of the same manufacturer, but you do gain communication elegance where you might have a little bit better throttling of the power. so that you're not utilizing the battery bank as much when you stay within systems that are of the same manufacturer. And so, there's a lot of little tiny nitpicky differences between different brands of inverters, and it gets to the point where we deal with this in the solar industry without batteries, where SMA has a reputation for being a very high-end inverter, and then you have the Solar Edge DC optimizer system, which is also a market leading solution. And it's actually it's a DC optimizer system, and it's a little bit lower price point than the high end SMA string inverter that doesn't have the optimizers. And it kind of drives me nuts because as a solar installer, I hate getting up on the rooftop and taking a module off of an existing array, because the hardware is not really designed to be, installed and removed and installed and removed and fixed and replaced. And so, these little module level optimizers might only be $50 or $60, but if one of them fails, then you have to get up on the roof, take the module off, swap out the optimizer, put the module back on, get off the roof. You're putting in 4 or 5 hours of labor to fix one failure point. And if you don't have any shade on your rooftop, it might be better to just remove those failure points and not have them. But a lot of the guys who are new to the industry, they look at the Solar Edge system at the lower price point than the SMA system, and what they don't realize is, hey, SMA, it's more expensive because it's doing PowerPoint tracking of each individual circuit going into it. So even though you're not doing shade mitigation at the module level, you're doing shade mitigation at the circuit level. Furthermore, SMA has this little separately derived output circuit where a lot of customers in Mississippi, they simply don't have the money to go off grid. And in these rural areas, they're very concerned about having power during the power outage, not so much for the power outage that only lasts a half an hour, but if a tornado or a hurricane rips through the woods and knocks down some power lines, it might take the cooperative 2 weeks to get out to the tail end of the distribution circuit to fix that particular customer's service. And so SMA, it could be as simple as wiring an outlet. You have the inverter on the outside of the home, you put the outlet on the inside of the home, and so during a power failure, you go and you plug in a battery into this power outlet, and that way you can have power during the day, keep your food from spoiling, and if you charge up a battery during the day, you have a little bit of power at night too. That might be enough to keep grandma's insulin medicine secure for the same price as getting this troublesome module level power electronic Solar Edge system, which might be a little bit lower cost and a little bit more efficient. And so the California developer says, why would I ever pay more money to go with the SMA system? Well, it really depends on the client. Similarly, you get what you pay for. You go for a higher end battery inverter, and usually it's going to have more functions of modes of operation or whatnot. Another thing that gets kind of confusing is, well, you go and you analyze the price and you say, well, why are battery inverters so much more expensive than batteryless inverters? You look at their pricing and they're like twice as expensive as batteryless inverters. And there's two reasons. One is they're just not manufactured to the same degree of volume. And so that alone has kept their pricing high. But also you have to remember this batteryless inverter is bidirectional. It takes power from the batteries and dumps it into the load, but it also charges the batteries back up. And this is something that it's weird to think about, but your solar inverter is one way. It's not bidirectional. And so there's more stuff inside that battery inverter. In fact, when you think about like your laptop battery inverter that plugs into the wall and takes your AC power from your wall and uses it to charge the DC power in your battery, that's one directional too. There is no product on the market that you just plug into the wall and it acts as a movable capacitor where it charges up the battery that's plugged into the wall, and then if you need it to, it could discharge the battery directly into the wall. That's kind of what a battery inverter does, but there's no let's say I wanted to have the same kind of lithium ion battery that powers your power tools. What if you wanted to plug that into the wall and use it for load leveling? That it would not have that functionality even if it were allowed by National Electric Code. A bidirectional inverter is inherently more expensive than a unidirectional inverter. And they also make battery inverters at the utility scale too. So, if you can do DC coupling from scratch for utility scale, it might be if you're doing commercial demand management and you're starting from scratch, that DC coupling would be the way to go. Another very difficult thing to understand is that your cheaper battery inverters may not be able to work during a power outage. What? Why would I buy a Tesla Powerwall if it won't power my home during a power outage? What's the point of having a battery on my home if the battery can only work when it's grid connected? That's not why I want a battery. I want battery for backup power. Well, it's a reason why some people want batteries, because they don't want batteries for losing electricity. They might live in a neighborhood where they never lose electricity, like Houston, Texas. It went through Tropical Storm Allison and then Ike, and they just lost power for a long time. And then when they rebuilt, the utility changed the locations of the transformers, elevated them above ground so that, when Harvey came through, they actually had to turn the power off to these communities that got flooded because the power stayed on and it became a safety hazard with all that water in the community. So they built a very robust grid and didn't really have a need for the backup power. And then what we'll see is that, and tomorrow when we get into our case studies, the economic motive for a grid connected battery is so much greater that, sure, there could be an inverter manufacturer out there that's just going for demand management and not for backup power. But even with say the SMA Sunny Island, if you have an AC coupled system, we have to remember that this inverter needs a grid signal to turn on. Because of its grid connected safety provisions, it's not allowed to turn on and backfeed the grid during a power outage. It has to shut down. It has to detect the grid before it turns on. Well, if there's a power outage and the grid is turned off and your batteries are full, your battery inverter is going to turn the solar array on. And then the sun sets and your solar array turns off. And now you're running off your batteries. Well, if you fully deplete your batteries and your batteries don't have any more power left into them, now your battery inverter can't turn on. And then the sun comes up and it turns on your solar array, but then your batteryless inverter still doesn't see the grid and doesn't turn on. And so that's kind of one disadvantage of an AC coupled system, particularly if you're designing an off-grid home. You want the batteries to be able to be fully deplete and then still turn your solar array on when the sun comes back. And that could be as simple as adding a generator to the system. And when you look at weather conditions, it's very hard to size a battery bank to get through the winter when the clouds are overcast. And so you might be able to get away with a battery bank that is 1/3 the size of a generator-less system by simply putting a small generator to get through the winter months. There's no problem with living off grid and having a diversity of options for power supply that's less risk. Certainly a generator is less capital cost than a solar battery. But at the same time, what happened in Hurricane Sandy is people ran out of gas. So, having that more expensive solar battery there has some advantage too. Even if the generator can do your whole house, if you had a smaller solar battery with the right generator, you could reduce the gas consumption of the generator, which would certainly be valuable to a hospital or Puerto Rico. And so if you really want off-grid capability and security without a generator, and again, this is a specific application, but there are solar customers who simply don't want to deal with gas. There's I had a this off-grid homeowner said, look, I understand that the generator is there for security, but I want you to design the system to not rely on the generator because I don't want to have to worry about hearing the generator turn on and thinking, oh no, am I about to run out of electricity if the gas in that generator is fully depleted? So he wanted the system to work as if it didn't need a generator and we still stuck the generator on for security. And there's a very expensive way of doing it, at least in terms of upfront capital cost. But if you do want to design a completely off-grid system and not have a generator or not have to worry about a generator, you would have to do DC coupling. And so when you look at all of the advantages of DC coupling over AC coupling and all of the advantages of AC coupling over DC coupling, it kind of comes down to, well, both options are very close together, but DC coupling does have an edge on off-grid systems, and AC coupling does have an edge when you're primarily selling back the surplus to the grid rather than just burning it off. So if you have someone to sell the electricity back to, AC coupling is a good way to go. And you might do a small DC couple there. And then if you do a DC couple system and you want to add on additional capacity, you still might stick on some AC coupling down the road. So it's not, it's really just a debate over your starting point. But hey, we're engineers. We like to think about optimal systems. I do think that there's one company that is worthy to kind of mention, called Pika Solar. They're located in Portland, Maine. And the reason, I generally don't like to get too much into brand name mentioning unless the products do something that's unique. And what I like about Pika is they actually do a couple of unique things. The first is, they look at string level optimization and also the need for rapid shutdown, which you're de-energizing the array up on the rooftop. So the problem with the SMA inverter is that even though you can land the 3 circuits directly onto the inverter, because of National Electric Code, you still have to de-energize these modules when they come off the rooftop. And so on SMA systems, I love just taking the modules and going directly back to the inverter and not doing any combining or anything like that. But that would be for a ground mount array. I would still have to terminate the wires up on the rooftop and use a rapid shutdown junction box to make the SMA system code compliant. And by the time you sum up all those parts, most installers would rather just do SolarEdge or other kinds of systems. Solar circuits are commonly sized to get all the way up to 600 volts. They may not operate at 600 volts, but they're sized for a maximum of 600 volts. And like the SolarEdge optimizers say, well, since we're using 600 volt components, let's step that electricity up in voltage. And so normally, your modules are going to be outputting around, just under 38 volts each. But on the coldest day of the year under full sun, they might get up to, let's just call it 50 volts. And then the circuits are sized for 600 volts. And so what that means is you typically get about 11 to 12 modules per circuit. And what the SolarEdge system will do is it'll regulate the voltage coming out of every single module, because you're sizing for this 50 volts, but they're normally operating at around 40 volts. And so the SolarEdge system, by stepping up the voltage to its maximum, will allow you to stick a couple more modules onto a given circuit. And that does have its own unique advantages. I like using a pre-assembled metal-clad cable going from the rooftop all the way down to the service panel that's pre-bundled. And I don't use it all the time because it's very expensive, but it makes the home run circuit very easy for internal wire runs. And I like doing internal wire runs where I can for a variety of reasons. But the thing is, the SolarEdge system will step that electricity up to 600 volts, and then when it gets to the battery, like the Tesla Powerwall that's at just under 400 volts, it needs to step that voltage back down to the battery voltage, and then you get to your coming out of the inverter. And so what Pika does is they say, you know what? We're not going to do module level optimization. We're going to do string level optimization. So you have one optimizer per string. And instead of stepping all the way up to 600 volts, we're just going to step up to the 400 volt or so of the battery circuit. And so you do, instead of getting 20 module long strings, you only get 8 module long strings. But when you have 8 module long strings, the impacts of shading are less important. You can do a 20 module long string with a box that controls every module on the rooftop, and so shading isn't important. Or you can do shorter circuits and get rid of all the electronics underneath the array and mitigate shade that way. Because usually, if you have like a tree that's shading the array, it's not just shading one module for a substantial period of time. It might be shading all the modules on that corner for a longer period of time. And so depending on where your circuits are, that's more of a solar thing. But what Pika does is they get to string optimizers rather than module optimizers, so that you can put all of your electronics right at the edge of the array rather than scattered throughout the array, and that makes your maintenance a lot easier. And then they have the same voltage coming out of the array as they go into the battery, and so you get a little bit of an efficiency gain, but you also reduce your failure because you're only processing the energy from, say, up to a normal operating voltage of around 400 volts down to the battery voltage of lithium ion, around 380 volts or so. Whereas going from 30 volts to 600 volts and then back down to 380 volts, you have to convert the electricity twice. And that's not just an efficiency loss, it's also an opportunity for failure. Anyway, I'm actually surprised that there aren't more string optimizers on the market. But I like they also have a battery management system where it can actually accommodate multiple kinds of battery chemistry plugged into the same DC bus. And so you can have, they have a high voltage AGM lead acid battery in addition to a lithium ion battery option. Um, that said, I've never installed them because I like doing, name brand companies that have a long track record. I like doing Schneider, even though Schneider, kind of, installers are very loyal to their inverter companies, and so companies are. Schneider bought Xantrix out, and so everyone who was still using Outback said, "Yay, Outback won that battle." And SMA is top quality too. So the guys like me who have been in the industry for a decade, they generally kind of, not for really any reason other than pettiness, kind of sneer at Schneider because Schneider does all sorts of electric components. But when it comes down to spending $80,000 on a system, I like to know that the company will stick around for decades. So there are ways that you can optimize the relationship between your solar voltage and your battery voltage going into the inverter and then coming out. And so instead of, with lead acid, you're really going from, say, 600 volts all the way down to 48 volts and then all the way back up to 240 volts. Whereas in an optimized system, you might go from 400 volts on the rooftop to the 380 volt battery bank to the 240 volt inverter. And that will give you the longest life out of your system with the least amount of component failure in theory. Now, there's nothing better than having decades of experience on the market. Certainly the first generation of any product is going to have, troublesome, buggy issues to work out. So that's not a universal truth, but for the techies and the early adopters, just know that there should be an optimal design configuration for all this stuff, which basically would be a DC coupled architecture that keeps your voltages up high. And for those reasons, you have a bias in the industry towards higher voltage kind of lithium ion battery banks that are certainly better quality than lower voltage lead acid. But by quality, we're really talking about system efficiency, and that's not quite the same as cost effectiveness. And as we'll get into economic modeling tomorrow, what we'll kind of discover is that there's still, and I had to discover this on my own because I didn't believe it. I travel all over teaching solar classes, and when I started to learn about batteries, there's kind of one salt of the earth solar installer that just says, I only use flooded lead acid because that means I get maintenance contracts instead of lithium ion. And all the guys out in California, and the software that will show you for helping you size all these systems together, I ask him, well, what do you see for load connected batteries? And it's all high-end lithium ion batteries out in California, but they also have tremendous subsidy for batteries out in California. So that might not tell you the full picture either. And so we'll take a hard look at the economic modeling of this stuff tomorrow, and kind of look at some costs and stuff like that. But just keep in mind, some kind of important questions to ask when you're designing your system is, if my battery's fully drained, how would the battery inverter start? So is the battery inverter capable of holding back a little bit of voltage so that it can start the solar array in the morning? Or are you using DC coupled so you get a little more capacity out of that battery because the charge controller doesn't need to recognize the grid like the AC coupled solar inverter would need to? What is really the functional difference between a batteryless inverter and a charge controller? I mean, the charge controller should be cheaper than the buying two inverters. But because of economies of scale, there's a wide variety of competing batteryless inverters out there. You might find that the AC coupled architecture is as cheap as the DC coupled, even though the DC might have fewer parts. Like that Pica system, the biggest problem I have with it is it's they say it's the optimal system, but it's still a high price point. What kind of battery inverter and where you tie it in to your load is, well, what are you really trying to do? What kind of power outage are you designing it for? You might just do a commercial load leveling battery inverter, and that battery inverter may be capable of providing backup power to your building. But if it's tied into like the energy distribution panel ahead of all other loads, that could power your full building. Whereas if you tie it into a sub panel, it may only be capable of isolating the sub panel and powering a critical load. And there are instances where powering a critical load is better than powering the full building, because you're less likely to have your kid's Xbox draining the battery down when you're concerned about your deep freeze. And likewise in a hospital, they prioritize, what's called emergency power, which is technically different than backup power and has harsher applications of National Electric Code. Emergency power needing to be there for needing to be on for life support, evacuating a building, whereas backup power is less critical. And then finally, another kind of design constraint is my utility going to put me onto a solar discriminatory rate structure, or a battery discriminatory rate structure, or an electric vehicle discriminatory rate structure, because I want to monkey around with my building's electricity? And I think this deserves more of a debate, because in the past it's been, you're a residential homeowner, and so you get the residential rate structure and the residential meter fee. And that doesn't matter if you are a hippie German who is designing the most energy efficient low power home, or if you're a Bitcoin mining gamer who has a giant electric use, and you like the windows open and the air conditioning on full blast. You're all paying the same meter fee regardless of how you use the energy on site. And with commercial customers, they have that access to that demand rate structure, which is actually now perhaps more beneficial for solar. And not all residential customers have that, but at least it used to be kind of, you just only lump customers into general groups. You're a residential customer, you're a commercial customer, or you're a commercial customer with a demand load profile. Well, nowadays you might have a deregulated grid where you can choose your rate structure, or you might be like the Southeast United States, where we're still very regulated, and where it might be that they like that fixed meter fee. They might say, well, you have solar on your property, so we're going to give you a rate structure where your meter fee goes up. And so even if you're producing your own electricity, you're still going to pay us our cut. And in the past, that argument has passed water, because you're using the grid. You're outflowing electricity onto the grid. You're using grid infrastructure. And while there are counter arguments, at the end of the day, you're using the toll road. You need to pay the toll. But what if you decide to not use the grid? What if you decide that solar discriminatory fee, if that is indeed what you're up against, is not worth paying. Is it possible to design the system to not do any outflow? And the answer is yes. Like the SMA inverter, the battery inverters will have an option for metering, putting a separate current transducer meter around your main, and then when it detects outflow, it'll either shut off the solar array or throttle back the solar array. And they have to do that in areas that have so much solar saturation that they're not allowed to backfeed the grid anymore. And then you say, well, doesn't PURPA allow you to do that? Well, yes, but if your grid's 100% renewable, then they don't have to abide by PURPA because your electricity is no cleaner than their electricity. And so, in the middle of the day, if you have a utility that's running off 100% solar and wind, they don't have to abide by PURPA anymore in the middle of the day. And so they can say, you can't outflow. You're not allowed to interconnect unless you stop outflowing. And so then the question is, well, how would I design such a system? And there's actually a term for it. It's called grid assist. And that's where you would take the solar array that would normally be kind of on connected to the grid, connected to your load, and here's your battery bank. Well, now we have a transfer switch between the grid and your solar array, and we still have the battery tied in through a load side connection. And so, you're powering from the grid at night, and then during the day, you're running off your solar array and your battery. And you say, well, why would you do that? And it's because, well, you're not really cycling your battery. You're not designing your battery to do 100% off grid. You're not even designing your battery to do demand management or anything like that. The battery is really just there so that you don't lose power during the transfer and to turn your solar array on if it needs to be turned on. But, if your batteries are ever fully depleted and your solar array's off, you can switch back onto the grid and charge the batteries back up. And that sounds like a pretty good solution, except what it also means is that if your solar array is producing more power than what your home needs, you're just burning it off. You're not able to sell it back to the grid. So, what that inherently means is we're using our clean electricity in the least efficient method possible for society. And so that will raise, if our electric policy forces solar customers off grid, that will raise the price of electricity for non-participants rather than lower the price of electricity for non-participants. So there is a policy concern if that is indeed what the rate structures are doing on these regulated grids. And so then the issue gets into that separately derived neutral, which is to say, if I want to use an automatic transfer switch and I'm keeping the neutral line the same, which is necessary to to detect a grid failure and disconnect from the grid, and then to if you completely disconnect from the grid, if you completely disconnect from that neutral, at that point you can establish your own neutral. So that's fine, but the problem is you're completely disconnected from the grid. So if the grid is down and comes back online, you would have to manually transfer back. You wouldn't be able to get that automatic transfer. So whether or not that's a huge problem or not is perhaps perhaps that's surmountable. But look, here I am on a regulated grid where they have really almost, presented misinformation to the Public Utility Commission about net metering. And what I'm talking about that is the TVA has no net metering policy, but they got out of Mississippi's net metering law by saying they had a net metering policy. And because it was a solar incentive policy on a standalone connection that has similar economic benefits to net metering, they were able to exempt themselves from the state's net metering law. And then the other utilities in the state that are not on net meter, that that are required to have net metering were able to reduce the value of the loss so that even though retail is around 11 cents, the net metering compensation is about 4 cents, and it's instantaneous. It's not at the end of the month or at the end of the year or whatever. So it's most US solar workers would not consider Mississippi's net metering law to actually be net metering. Take it with a grain of salt. A lot of countries are just establishing their right to interconnection. So, it's not to say that this isn't a nuanced conversation, but you go to Mississippi Power or Power's website, and it'll say under their frequently asked questions, they will define the definition of grid connected. And so they say if your renewable generation is connected to electrical wiring that is powered by the electric grid at any point, it is considered to be a grid connected array. So even in a completely separately derived solar array that completely isolates and disconnects itself from the grid when in operation, and then only reconnects to the grid when the system is completely de-energized and shut down, the power companies are still defining that as being grid connected. And so, what we see in this is a coming battle in the future between, maybe not fossil fuels and renewable energy, but between big renewables and consumer-owned renewables. And the lines are kind of being drawn in policy right now. And, that's whether or not this is a real concern that people should actually be concerned about outside the solar industry is probably more a matter of personal interest than anything more real than that. And so, it could result in an instance where a consumer is given the choice between remaining grid connected and paying a high meter fee or going off grid, at which point we have to really ask ourselves, well, what's the cost of batteries? What's the cycle cost of batteries? Is it cost effective to go off grid? And that's when we need to come back down to earth a little bit, get off our soapbox and say, okay, well, how much is the meter fee? And is the value of that grid connection worthwhile? So, even if I'm not buying any electricity from the utility, how much is it worth just to have that there as a backup if I need it? And surveys, albeit non-scientific surveys, have indicated that solar customers who've completely negated their electric bill with net metering are still willing to pay meter fees even though they're not using any electricity from the grid just to have it there. So they're not unwilling to get out of paying into the grid for it existing. And so the question is really just how much can that meter fee be before people start disconnecting from the grid? And we look at, say, what many would consider to be a high meter fee at the residential level. You look at a $30 a month meter fee. Saving that money 12 months out of the year, for 10 years, that's $3,360, whereas the batteries to power a home off grid, and we're not talking about like a vacation rental on a cabin on the lake. We're talking about actual homes with, husband, wife, and 2 kids, and a dog and a fridge and the electrical consumptive lifestyle that we as Americans are used to, which is way more than in other countries. But again, the batteries alone for the off-grid case study that we'll get into tomorrow, they cost about $29,000 versus paying for 10 years of grid connection, $3,300. That grid connection really is a bargain. that grid connection is less than a generator. So if it's a question of designing an off-grid system with a generator or designing an off-grid system with a grid connection, going with the grid connection is the better way to go. The only area where we see off-grid really being cost effective is when we're not just talking about paying that meter fee, but also paying for, running up a few power lines, hanging the transformer, establishing that electric service, just hanging the transformer and establishing the electric service can be, $4,000. And then, if you're a mile from the road, you might be looking at, interconnection fee of tens of thousands of dollars, at which point going off grid may be something to consider. So, where do we see customers really wanting to consider off grid? In rural areas where you're losing power 4 times a year, um, if you're at the end of the distribution circuit in a rural area, you may see your power blipping quite often. Generally, these are people like retirees who are at home all the time, or people who work from home who are in rural areas who are at home all the time. Um, they're the ones who really want battery and off grid capability added to their solar array. Um, Likewise, smaller systems like a hunting cabin, where you might only be using the hunting lodge for 2 out of every 7 days during hunting season. Well, then you don't need a battery bank that can fully power a home continuously. You can do a smaller battery bank that can, get around. And then if you run out of electricity, you're either camping or you go home. It's not really necessary to oversize the battery bank, where something where you can get away with a smaller array and a smaller battery bank, like billboard lighting or smaller applications. So, I was doing a site assessment for this customer who has a $35 a month residential meter fee from his cooperative, and the TVA is looking at increasing meter fees by another $10 or so. And so he's like, I have my house, and that was what the site evaluation was for. And then he's like, and then I have another meter over there on its own service, and it's to power his recreational vehicle, and he pays $50 a month, and most of that is his meter fee. He spends $35 a month on his meter fee and $15 a month on electricity. So he's really not buying electricity at 11 cents a kilowatt hour. He's buying his electricity at 25 cents a kilowatt hour. And so where your meter fee is the bulk majority of your electric bill, that's an application that can go off grid now in a cost effective manner. If they're going to charge you, if you want to build a cabin out in the woods for hunting, and they're going to charge you $4,000 to hang a transformer on the power lines, and the power lines go right by your property, you might say, well, I'd rather just, put in a $4,000 AGM battery and a solar array and budget my electricity when I'm out there, do my laundry at home, live off of nuts and beef jerky, and not pay that meter fee every month. In those cases, you might see those applications being disconnected from the grid, even though the option for grid connection is there. But for most homes, if they're connected to the grid, for most buildings, businesses may be a little bit different. This doctor who I built the off-grid home for, he immediately after the project started thinking about his office, because his office is paying a couple $100s a month in for that 3-phase connection. And unlike his home, nobody uses his office during the day. So he immediately started thinking about, well, could I take my office off grid? And for all those reasons and more reasons, which we'll get into tomorrow, uh, it might be that these smaller applications and then the commercial segment is really where the big battery market is. Okay, so we are out of time today. Just to give you a preview of where we're going tomorrow is we've kind of talked about different things to evaluate when putting your system architecture tomorrow together. And then tomorrow is going to be a lot of case study for that. So you have my email address in this chat box. If any of you have interval data that you want me to bring up in class and take a look at, go ahead and email me your interval data from your meter, and I'll use that as an example. Otherwise, we'll just use the examples that I have. With that, we're out of time, and so I'll pass it back to Half Moon. Let's see, I'm not hearing Half Moon. They may be on. I might not just be able to hear them, but anyone there? Okay, well, anyway, there may be a quiz that pops up when we end the program. Don't take it too seriously because we're only halfway through and it's really just there to be verify your attendance. If you don't get the quiz, it'll be emailed to you in about an hour after the program. So just make sure you click through it to verify your attendance. And with that, we will see you tomorrow.